Well, I'm really excited to introduce Daniel Elizalde. We got to know each other speaking at large product conferences, and he's one of my favorite product people. Always a pleasure to talk with him. He is currently VP and head of IoT product management at Ericsson. Before that, he was very active as an IoT product management coach. As I mentioned, he's a speaker. He also teaches classes. He's taught at Stanford Continuing Studies, and he has his own online class. Before that, he's a product leader at several startups. Again, his Twitter handle is at @Elizalde, and his website is his name, danielelizalde.com. If you want to check out stuff, he's got a free newsletter that's great if you want to opt in for that. And Daniel's going to be talking to us today about how to drive product innovation with emerging technologies. He's an expert in that field. So with that, why don't I let you go ahead and share your screen and take it over, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Dan. I'm very excited to be here. You know, we've been talking about this for some time, so I'm really excited to be able to share with you today. Thank you everybody for coming. I'm going to share my screen. See if you can see it. Can you see my screen now? Should be okay, right?
Yep, it looks great. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Okay, so let's get started. So I have a few slides, and I will walk you through some of these concepts before we go into the fireside chat and the Q&A. And the topic really is how to drive product innovation with emerging technologies. And I'm very passionate about this idea of leveraging emerging technologies and innovation, and how does product management play into the whole thing. So I want to share with you some concepts of how I think about the leadership aspect of product management with emerging technologies, and a lot of the lessons learned that I've had the opportunity to learn the hard way throughout my career. I've been very lucky to always work in cutting edge technology. So whether it is IoT or energy storage solutions and AI and virtual reality and robotics, and I've had that opportunity. And so I want to share with you from a perspective of where we are in the profession today, and how does the profession need to adapt a little bit as we move into these technologies. Please let me know your questions. We're happy to discuss them as well. So I want to talk, this talk is going to be divided in 3 topics, really talk, for a very short period about the opportunity and the success rate. So we hear a lot about these emerging technologies. And what I mean by emerging technologies is a lot of these things that we hear that are the big technology trends of our times, right? So AI, machine learning, blockchain, IoT, virtual reality, augmented reality, 5G. I'm putting them in the same group, and of course they are radically different, but they have some shared commonalities that I want to share with you here, on how we should think about them from a product perspective. Talking about delivering solutions, not only products, and then a few best practices for driving innovation. So before I jumped in, I had this thought about why is it that I'm talking about driving innovation with emerging technologies. As you know, as product managers, we are focused on solving problems, and yet emerging technologies is a solution. And so it's kind of backwards. And from a lot of what Dan has shared with us in his book, which talks about the problem space and the solution space, as product leaders, we focus on the problem space. So why should we care about emerging technologies? So the reason why I like talking about this is because we can't escape hearing a lot about emerging technologies in our companies, and our executives are going to be coming to us and talking about all these things. So we need to understand what they are, what are the challenges, and what are the benefits, so how we can use them. And then if they are actually a good fit for our companies and our products and our customers, then we need to understand what does it mean to drive innovation with these technologies, so that we can get the trust of the team, that we can actually have a roadmap that makes sense with these constraints. And of course, we can provide value to our customers. So that's why I'm mixing the two. So with that introduction, let's talk about where do we start, or where are we today? I'd like to talk about emerging technologies from the Diffusion of Innovation Law. And this diagram is from the book Crossing the Chasm from Geoffrey Moore, which is one of my favorite product people. And he was a speaker in Dan's meetup a few months ago. And so I'm very excited to to be here talking about this. And what the law of diffusion of innovation talks about is that all customers, they fall in different buckets, so to speak, on when they adopt certain technology. And it says that about 2.5% of those people are what they call innovators, about 13% early adopters, about 34% the early majority, late majority, and laggards. And you can see that it's a bell curve, so it's a normal distribution, and you can see that the bulk of the people is in the early majority and late majority. But before you get there, there's this chasm. And it's really hard for companies to jump that. And what we're seeing is that in the innovators and early adopter parts, that's usually technology enthusiasts. So the people that actually care about technology, AI, 5G, edge, the people that are actually talking about these things usually fall into this realm. So there is, as a product leader, there is some business to be had here, but it's rather small. And what we're seeing is that if you take IoT as an example, about 70% of deployments of IoT, and I'm talking more about industrial deployments, they're stuck in this portion. So there's a bunch of pilots that prove the concept, but they don't go anywhere. They don't get to scale. And that's part of the challenge. As product leaders, we want to make sure that our MVPs get some traction on the early adopters, but then we move to the early majority, and that's when your business can actually start to take off. And so what we've learned is that the early majority is no longer technology enthusiasts. The early majority consists of pragmatists. And the definition of these pragmatists are that they have a pain today, and they're willing to try a technology only if they works, but really they care about a full solution. At this point, they don't care how you're going to solve the problem. They don't care if you use AI or IoT or quantum computing. As long as you can solve their business problem, that's how you will actually get their attention. And so as product leaders, we need to figure out how to understand the challenges of the pragmatists so that we can offer them those solutions and be able to jump the chasm. So driving innovation with emerging technologies is actually thinking about the needs of this group of people so that you can jump the technologies enthusiasts of the technology, because there's really not a lot of business there. So here I talk about solutions, and I'm going to explain more about what do I mean by that and give you some examples. In my definition here, what I'm calling a solution is something that incorporates technology capabilities to create products and services to address a customer pain. And I've highlighted in this definition a few areas that I think are really important, and I'm going to talk about this in the rest of the presentation. First of all, is technology capability. So it's not the technology itself, it's what you can do with it. That's the first thing. And then notice that I'm talking about products and services. Sometimes what solves the problem is not a product, it's actually a service. And when we start dealing with emerging technologies have this characteristic that they enable a lot of service revenue. So we need to understand how that works so that as product people, we can take advantage of that. And first and foremost, addresses the customer pain. If we are not solving the customer pain, it doesn't matter what type of technology we're using. It doesn't matter. It's a moot point. So I'm going to walk through some of these components in the rest of the presentation before I give you some advice on the best practices. So let's talk about value. And what I see in most companies is that when we're talking about this type of emerging technologies, everybody is very technology forward. They're thinking, we need an AI strategy. We need an IoT strategy. How can we increase our market share if we use virtual reality? But in reality, that's not the point, because we know pragmatists don't care about that. So the important thing from a product leader perspective is to understand what those technologies are, and then what value can you extract by using those technologies. And this is important because you don't want to become an expert in the actual technology. That's not our job. What we need is to understand the value that can be extracted. So for example, if we talk about the Internet of Things, the Internet of Things is a network of connected devices that have sensors that acquire data from the real world, can process that data, send that to a centralized location in the cloud, and provide some insights. That's what the technology does. And so the value that you can get out of that is, well, if you have some sort of internet solution, you can analyze and control your customer's physical environment in real time. 5G is another example, right? Well, with 5G, everybody's talking about that right now. But with 5G, the benefit really is that you can connect large number of devices and move large amounts of data very fast with very low latency. That is the value that we can provide to our customers. Another example, with artificial intelligence or machine learning, you can generate actionable insights from large amounts of data. And so the question here from a product perspective is, let's take the Internet of Things. If your customer has a specific challenge that can be addressed by adding sensors and acquiring real-time data from the field, then the Internet of Things, it's an emerging technology that can actually help you provide more value. Or if you have a specific challenge that requires to move large amounts of data back and forth wirelessly, well, 5G can actually help you there, okay? So that's the mindset that I wanna leave you with. It's not about what the technology can do. The technology itself has no value for the customer. It is whatever value you can extract from that technology to solve the customer's pains. And I'll give you some examples on that. So a couple of examples here, as I mentioned. So let's talk about a retail example. And of course, as product managers, we focus on the actual persona. And so let's say that we talk to retail managers and we can summarize, synthesize the pain as, we lose over 25% of our inventory to theft every year. That's an actual problem that they have. No retail manager has ever said, I wish I had an AI solution with beacons on every aisle. Nobody cares, right? The problem really is we lose over 25% of our inventory to theft. Is there a way that you can use technology to solve this? And the answer might be no. The answer might be spend half as much and hire 3 more security officers, and that's better, right? It's okay, it's valid. So if that's the challenge, your company could say, well, a proposed solution, and I highlight proposed because this is your hypothesis, could be a system that tracks the inventory on the shelves and monitors customers to alert theft to the authorities. Okay? That's what the solution could be. And then based on the specific requirements, you can leverage the Internet of Things to have sensors on every aisle. You can move a lot of that data in real time through 5G, through a dedicated network or to a remote network. And you can use artificial intelligence either at the edge or at the cloud to process what's going on from either those sensors, or you can have cameras moving all the data around. And that's how all those things fit together. But notice that the innovation really comes from understanding the pain and then backtracking what a potential solution could be. I give you a different example. Let's talk about an energy example. So let's say that an electric utility operator, after our discovery sessions, we synthesize the pain and they say, well, we lose a lot of money when power lines fail since we are not able to meet our customers' commitments. So the problem is they're losing money because power lines are failing. So a proposed solution could be a service providing zero unplanned downtime by monitoring the power lines in real time. And this is where we really need to go the next step. Oftentimes when we talk about these emerging technologies, technology-driven companies stop at the providing the insights on a screen. And in this particular case, the problem is not, I would love to see some data about power lines failing. They might not even care, or they might not have the manpower to actually do something about that. But if the real problem is that they're losing money because power lines fail, you could actually provide a service that provides the on-zero plant time, and they can actually solve the problem. Now, the service could leverage these emerging technologies to provide you all the insights, but you are able to provide a service instead of just a product. Another approach is switching who your customer is. You might say, if the service is what solves the problem, instead of selling to the utilities, I am going to sell to service providers that service the utilities, and my product is going to service them so that they can solve the problem of the customer. So that's the type of thinking that we need to do in order to understand how do we move forward with this. And again, this solution could have, in my image, you can have a drone taking real-time images of the power lines, and these are real applications, by the way. Real-time feeds of the power lines, transmitting them through 5G with very low latency, analyzing in real time, and then inspecting and passing reports on whether something is right or wrong. So that's the idea. That's the concept that I want to share with you. Now, if we go one level deeper here, I wanna take a look at what does a solution really look like, because one of the challenges with emerging technologies is they're very fuzzy. They're this big umbrella of things that it's hard to put our finger on what exactly are we talking about. And so when I say a solution, and I'm using IoT here because it's a more comprehensive one, it will have all these different components. So for example, if we think about the power lines monitoring example, that solution, the way it's actually implemented, it might have the devices that are looking at the lines that could be mounted on the drones. You might need an on-premise edge to send the data, or a telco edge. You might need connectivity wirelessly to move things around. You might have a telecommunications edge. You might have a cloud, and you might have applications to do all that. And you can see how all the pieces start fitting together, because in this overarching IoT solution, you can have all the other emerging technologies put in together. So for example, you can do AI on the devices themselves, or on the premise, or on the cloud. You can have the connectivity be via 5G or NB-IoT. You can have edge compute to remove some of the latency. And so the takeaway here is that, as you can see, these solutions with emerging technology are very complex, have a lot of different parts, and the pragmatists don't care about the components. They care about everything put together to provide the value. And that value usually needs to be reflected across the life cycle of the product, not only during operation, but it needs to be easy to install, easy to deploy, provision, easy to maintain, etc. So this is what innovation really looks like with emerging technologies. It's very complex, and it has other complexities that I'll talk in a second. But the main takeaway is customers don't really care about each of the individual pieces, meaning AI by itself or IoT by itself might not be that valuable. Plus, like I said, pragmatists don't care about it. So let's talk about 5 practices, best practices that I've learned to drive innovation. And this is, of course, out of years of doing this really on the field, learning, testing a lot of these ideas. The way that I propose crossing this chasm with our proposed solutions is by using some lean concepts of quickly figuring out the desirability, feasibility, or viability of our solution, so that we can bridge this chasm. We can go from the early adopters and tinkerers of technology to a full-blown solution for the early majority. And I'm going to give you some examples. Notice that I'm going back to this idea of proposed solution, because when you propose a solution, it's a hypothesis. You still have to go out and test it out with customers to figure out whether it actually meets their needs, their willingness to pay, etc. And the extra complexity with emerging technologies is because they're so new. The feasibility is not as straightforward as it would be with other types of technology. For example, if your company is building a e-commerce site on the web, yes, it's very complex, but it's known. There's really nothing there that needs to be ironed out. It's just a matter of putting the time to develop it. And again, I'm not diminishing the complexity. But with emerging technologies, a lot of things are unknown. Can you actually fly an autonomous drone over miles and miles of power lines to relieve this value? It hasn't really been done. What are the characteristics? What are the challenges, right? So the feasibility to know that whether it can be done or not is something that a lot of companies that are looking for innovation in these areas overlook. And they believe, must be possible to do it, so I'm just going to go ahead and do it. And it's not that simple, right? So as product leaders, we need to emphasize those things and understand what does it actually take to build these solutions. If you could decide to go ahead and do it, what are some of the challenges? So let me walk you through these 5 best practices that I've learned. So the first one, because we're dealing with innovation, my recommendation is to focus on the desirability part. Start with a single use case for a single industry vertical. A lot of companies take something somewhat generic and say, connectivity or AI, and say, well, this could be applicable to all these different industries, and they dilute their efforts. And so what I recommend is really focusing on a single use case for a single industry vertical. If it is, like my example, retail, okay, then focus on retail and what use case? Let's say what's called shrinkage, which is people are stealing your items. Okay, well, focus on that for a while to make sure that you understand the industry, how they buy, the challenges of deployment, etc. I see a lot of companies just doing one of these and then going to one of, warehouse security and another one in agriculture, another one. And so they never get that traction and they never really get the learnings of desirability. Part of the challenge of us as product managers is to convince management that we need to focus. That is the challenge, right? Because usually companies want to do more, especially bigger companies. They say, well, we're bigger, we can put more resources. But again, the recommendation is focus on one use case and one vertical, whatever that might be, and have some exit criteria so that if that doesn't work, you can quickly pivot. The next point is also on desirability, and here it has to do with validate your customers' willingness to pay early on. A lot of companies make the mistake of thinking that because they're building this innovative solution which uses the latest and greatest, automatically the customer is going to want to pay for that. Keep in mind that these emerging technologies, because they're emerging, the economies of scale, the efficiency of development is still not there. So they're going to be quite expensive. And so oftentimes, I work with customers to deploy the solutions, and it turns out that the solution, even though it might be more efficient, is more expensive and it's not worth it to invest in it. Or it requires an overhaul of existing processes or existing infrastructure, and they're not willing to do that. Or they might say, for this price or for this complexity, I might, go with plan B. So for example, I've had conversations with manufacturing companies where you're looking at predictive maintenance of engines. And you can have a very fancy IoT, AI, 5G powered solution to give them predictive maintenance. And they say, for this price and complexity, I'd rather just buy 2 engines and run them by side. And that's enough to meet my business goal, right? So the willingness to pay before you go too deep, check that very, very quickly as much as you can. And this is all business model experimentation, which David Bland, who's also here in your meetup, Dan, is excellent, right? You should check out that session. The third point that I want to share is define your build versus buy versus partner strategy very quickly. And this has to do with the feasibility. It sounds like it has to do with viability, and it does too, but it has to do with feasibility. No single company can put together these solutions on their own. And big companies have tried, and believe me, they failed miserably. As you saw in my diagram, a complex solution like this might take hardware, might take software, embedded, connectivity, maybe some infrastructure like a 5G case, cloud, edge. So it's very important for you to understand as a company, where is your added value? If you're looking to solve this problem for a customer, what are you bringing to the table? Put your resources on that, and then make sure that you find the best partners, both from technology, channel partners, integration partners, to create the ultimate offering. And of course, the business model that you identify for this has to be profitable enough that you can share some earnings with all the different players that it takes to build solutions. And that's one of the big challenges why it's hard to make money at this point in this field, right? Because there's so many players, the profits get diluted. So very important, spend time and have criteria on this feasibility aspect. two more. Number 4, and this falls a little bit in the viability and feasibility perspective, and is understand what it takes to build, sell, and operate your solution at scale with profit. See, the technology has advanced so much in the last 20 years that, when I was building these systems 20 years ago, you needed an army of engineers to put some of these things together. Now, a college student or a high school student can buy a Raspberry Pi with sensors and run TinyML and connect with Wi-Fi, and you have a system running in 2 days. But from there to have a professional operational system that scales, it's a huge difference, right? A lot of companies that are new to this kind of technology, they don't understand what it takes to train models if you're doing AI, do deployment of physical systems, do maintenance of physical systems, how to patch security of distributed systems around the world, those kind of things. And so if you're able as a product person to kind of project what the cost would be of really operating this at scale, you will find out that maybe you don't have a business here because it's so expensive that puts you out of the market or the value is reduced. So it's better to know that early on than just go ahead and say, it doesn't matter when we get to scale, we will figure it out. I can tell you by experience, I've seen a lot of companies go under because they're not able to scale. And that is today one of the biggest challenges with this technology is that, yes, we can do all sorts of proof of concepts, but scaling is hard. And this is one of the reasons, right? So very, very important. And then the last lesson that I wanna share with you is the business modeling aspect of any product, and it has to do with the viability. And so here the lesson learned is to experiment with business models, find one that works for you, for your customers, your partners, and your company. And what I mean by this is that if you think about all the different parties that are going to be involved, you need to make sure that the business model is something that the customer is willing to adopt. It's very common to hear this trivial approach that, oh, if you're doing AI or you're doing IoT, you're going to go into a subscription model and that's the way to go. That's not true, right? Every product, every market, every company is different. So you need to find what type of business model works for your customer, and then does that provide enough profit for your partners as well? And is that something your company is willing to do? One challenge with innovation is that you might come up with a viable solution for your customers, but the way to execute it is very different than your standard business model from your company. And your company might say, yeah, that's great, but we can't do that. Like, we are a software company, we can't really be in the hardware installation. Or we're a product company, we see the benefit of doing services, but that's not our strategy. And so early on, make sure that whatever you're proposing will be aligned with what the rest of the company wants to take on, if you're able to find that market fit. Because I've been in that place. You are all the way to like, yes, the market would want this, and the company's, well, no, that's not something that we can actually support. So the more you can involve the rest of the stakeholders early on, and I'm talking more for a large company perspective, other business areas, the BD teams, etc., the better chances your innovation will have to see the light of day and actually scale. Okay, so a lot of complexity here as well. Okay, so to close the presentation, and then we can go to the fireside chat and Q&A. These emerging technologies, whether it's IoT, 5G, AI, VR, blockchain, you name it, they're very powerful tools, but they're just that, they're tools. Now, one could say, well, product management is agnostic of technology. It is true to understand the customer pain. Then you work with engineering to figure out a solution. But if the solution can leverage these emerging technologies, then the path to MVP and the path to scale is more complex than a non-emerging technologies product. So just keep that in mind, and that's why this is an exciting new field. Hopefully, 10 years from now, I'll be doing this talk and saying, remember when we had trouble with that? Just like today, we say, oh, remember when we started doing mobile apps? That was emerging technology back then, and we were all scrambling. Now, it's just how you build products. We will get there, but we're not there yet, and this is way more complex. And then, of course, if you want to scale, if you don't want to just die in the proof of concept phase, focus on the solutions, focus on what the pragmatist after the chasm wants, and that is the whole package of the offering, services, products, delivery, business model around potential technology implementations, and that's the only way that you're going to get to scale. And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Dan. Thank you so much. You can learn more about what we're doing at Ericsson and the IoT Studio, and I'm happy to take any questions and to go into the fireside chat.
Thank you so much. That was a great talk. Really appreciate you sharing advice.